On September 19, 1936, a London-based photographer working for Country Life magazine was taking photographs of Raynham Hall for an article. They would end up taking a photograph that would become known as one of the most famous examples of so-called spirit photography. The photograph known as the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall. Raynham Hall is a country house in Norfolk, England that has been the seat for the Townsend family for nearly 400 years. Building started in 1619 by Sir Roger Townsend. 100 years after that, the house was modernized for the second Viscount Townsend, Charles Townsend, and today that's essentially the house that we'll still see. Though what makes this hall so famous is the legend that it is haunted. The story goes that in 1713, Charles Townsend married a woman named Dorothy Walpole, who was the sister of Robert Walpole, a British statesman and Whig politician who is generally regarded as the first Prime Minister of Great Britain. Townsend was reportedly notorious for having a violent temper. So when gossip reached him about his wife possibly having an affair with Lord Wharton, he responded by locking his wife in her rooms in the family home. Though there are different versions of the legend. Another version of the legend say that Dorothy was tricked by the Countess of Wharton, who had invited Dorothy over to stay for a few days. This was because the Countess knew that Dorothy's husband, Lord Townsend, would never allow her to leave like that. Which is exactly what happened. When he found out about it, Townsend was furious, and to keep her there, he locked her in her rooms, where she would remain until her death in 1726. She was buried that same year, but according to the legend, her spirit remained. During the winter of 1835, Lord Townsend had invited guests to Raynham Hall to celebrate Christmas. One of these guests was Colonel Loftus, who later told the story of how he and another guest named Hawkins had been walking in the hallway approaching the bedrooms when they suddenly spotted a lady who was wearing a dated brown dress in the same hallway. The following evening, Loftus claimed that he saw the lady once again, but this time he got a better look at her. According to Loftus, this woman had empty eye sockets and her face appeared to be glowing. These two sightings of this alleged specter was the first reported sightings of the Brown Lady. And this report would apparently unsettle some of the staff so much that they left Raynham Hall and didn't come back. The second reported sighting came in 1836 by Captain Frederick Marryat. Marryat had allegedly requested to spend the night in the room that was said to be the most haunted room in Raynham Hall. The very room that had a portrait of the woman haunting the hall. Supposedly, the reason for this was that Marryat had a theory that these hauntings were not hauntings at all. Instead, he believed that the whole thing was caused by local smugglers who were anxious to keep people away from the area and thus away from their business. The story is told second-hand by Florence Marryat many years later in 1891. The story goes that Marryat set up in that room to prove that it wasn't haunted. But as he believed that the hauntings were caused by local smugglers, he slept each night with a loaded revolver under his pillow for protection. For the first 2 nights, nothing happened. No apparition, no smugglers. But then, on the 3rd night, Marryat would be in his shirt and trousers as he had been undressing to go to bed when 2 young men who were related to the Lord and Lady knocked on the door. They told him that a new gun had just arrived from London, and they wanted the captain to come over to inspect the gun to give them his opinion. The young man's room was on the other side of this very long corridor, with the bedrooms facing each other. It was a pretty long walk, but due to the late hour, Marriott didn't bother to get dressed as he didn't think anyone would see him. As they were leaving, he grabbed his revolver and jokingly held it up and said, "In case you meet the brown lady." He then followed the men to their room where they showed him the gun. After the inspection was over, the men would jokingly tell Marriott that they would accompany him back to his own room in case he meets the brown lady. The hour was very late, so all the lights had been extinguished, which cast the long corridor completely in darkness. As the men were about halfway through the corridor, they saw a flicker of what looked like a lamp or a lantern moving towards them from the other side of the corridor. They didn't think this was anything odd, as they just assumed that it was one of the women going to visit the nurseries. Each of the rooms of this very long corridor had a double door with space in between them. As Marriott had been undressing to get ready for bed and didn't bother to get dressed again to look at this gun, he suddenly felt that he was improperly dressed to greet a lady. So he slipped into one of the outer doors to conceal himself until the lady had walked by them. The younger men followed his example, and now all three men were hiding behind the door. Through the chink of the door, they could see the figure approach, and they watched her come closer and closer until she was close enough for them to see her face more clearly, which, to their surprise, appeared the same as the woman in the portrait, known as the Brown Lady. Marriott had his finger on the trigger of his revolver, and he was about to jump out into the corridor to demand this figure to explain its presence. But before he could, the figure had stopped on the other side of the door that the men were hiding behind, holding up the lamp that she was carrying and looking directly at the door. The figure grinned in a way that Marriott felt was malicious and diabolical. Apparently, this sight of a woman grinning was apparently enough to infuriate Marriott, who proceeded to rush into the hallway, hold up his revolver, and shoot directly at the figure's face. The figure instantly disappeared, and the bullet would pass through the outer door of the room on the opposite side of the corridor and got lodged in the panel of the inner door. This entire encounter lasted for several minutes, and afterwards, Marriott never tried to interfere with the legend of the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall ever again. Another sighting of the ghosts would come many years later, in 1926, when Lady Townsend reported that her son and his friend had claimed to see the ghost on the staircase. They had allegedly identified this figure with the portrait of Lady Dorothy Walpole, and sightings of the Brown Lady have lessened over the years. So much so that stories claim that the ghosts have moved on from the hall and is now haunting the nearby Houghton Hall and Sandringham House. On September 19, 1936, photographers from Country Life magazine arrived at the hall to take pictures for an article. The duo, Captain Hubert C. Pravand and his assistant, Indra Shira, spent some time taking pictures around the residence. And it was when they were photographing the hall's main staircase that the strange event allegedly occurred. They had already taken one photograph of the staircase and were setting up to take a second one when Shira supposedly saw a misty form that ascended the stairs. Shira was then in a hurry to take the photograph as fast as possible. So he quickly asked the captain if he was ready, to which the captain replied yes. So he quickly took off the cap of the lens while Shira pressed the trigger to activate the camera's flash. The end result of this was the image that would become known as the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall. The captain hadn't noticed the apparition himself as he was under the focusing cloth. But after removing the cloth from his head, he had quickly asked Shira what all the excitement was about. Shira would then explain what he had seen. The captain apparently did not believe him, and even bet him £5 that the developed photos would show nothing out of the ordinary. But according to the story, it did. Allegedly, there were 3 witnesses to the development of the negatives. This was because Shira had wanted an independent observer to verify the event. The person chosen for this was a chemist called Benjamin Jones, who managed the premises above which the development studio was located. The account of this ghostly experience, as well as the photograph, would be published in Country Life magazine on December 26, 1936, with another magazine publishing the story shortly after. Unsurprisingly, this story garnered a lot of attention, and soon a paranormal investigator named Harry Price took an interest in the story. He would interview Provand and Shira, and he later reported that he had no right to disbelieve their story. He also reported that the negative had not been tampered with and wasn't a fake. Experts at the Country Life offices would also examine the photo, and they also came to the conclusion that it was unlikely that the negative had been tampered with. Despite most believing in the photo and the conclusion by experts at the time that the photograph was genuine, there were and is still a lot of skepticism with a variety of explanations for the photograph. One theory is that Shira had faked the image by putting grease or a similar substance on the lens in the shape of a figure. Others say that he faked the image by moving down the stairs himself during an exposure. One person who believed in this theory was a magician named John Booth, who wrote that the photograph could be duplicated by naturalistic methods, and he decided to try to prove it. Booth had another magician named Ron Wilson cover himself in a bedsheet and descend the grand staircase at the Magic Castle in Hollywood. The end result did end up looking quite similar to the famous Brown Lady photograph. Other skeptics say that this wasn't a deliberate hoax, rather that the image was either an accidental double exposure or that light had somehow gotten into the camera. For instance, American skeptic and investigator of the paranormal, Joe Nickell, wrote that a detailed examination of the photograph had shown evidence of double exposure. Other critics have pointed out that the image of the lady very closely resembles that of a standard Virgin Mary statue that can be found in any Catholic church, which I have to admit was the first thing I thought of when I saw this photograph. The photograph of the Brown Lady actually reminded me of another ghost event where the Virgin Mary supposedly played a big part. The event that is known as Our Lady of Zaytun, which was a mass apparition reported to have occurred in a district of Cairo, Egypt, during a period of about 3 years. Of course, the traditional image of a ghost is one that has a white cloth or a bedsheet covering its entire body with holes for eyes. So if we believe that the image is fake, it makes sense that the men would draw inspiration from something similar, such as the Virgin Mary or a typical ghostly image. But what's interesting too is that all 3 of these sightings describe a different apparition. They have all described a different apparition. And if you believe that the lady is haunting the hall, how you see her might depend on who is seeing her, as different people might see different things. There have also been some skepticism regarding the 2 men in this story, Captain Provand and Mr. Shira. It has been suggested that both of these names, Provand and Shira, are nothing but aliases, fake names. The man who called himself Shira supposedly took his name from his wife's professional name, which was Madame Indre Shira, and she was a fairly successful society psychic, palmist, and astrologer in 1930s London. And Captain Provand was not a captain at all. He had supposedly been a photography tutor in the Navy during the war, and the 2 had faked the photograph using a Virgin Mary figurine, and then they created the story about being commissioned to take photographs of Raynham Hall for Country Life magazine. it's also important to remember that spirit photography was not a new phenomenon, even in the 1930s. Ever since the first photograph was taken in either 1826 or 1827, photographers have experimented with various techniques and effects. One such was the daguerreotype process, where the image was developed directly from the exposure plate. This meant that multiple exposure usually did not occur, but it was still possible for passing movement to leave a faint image, as this technique required long exposures. Scottish scientist Sir David Brewster recognized in 1856 that these effects could be used deliberately to create ghostly images, and his idea would then later be used by the London Stereoscopic Company to create a series of images that are called the ghost in the stereoscope. This led to even more experimenting with these techniques. And, of course, it also led to some photographers realizing that these techniques could be exploited for profit. One such photographer was William Mumler. At the time when he started taking his ghostly images, the United States were still reeling from the Civil War, which had claimed 620,000 lives. And it makes sense that many of the grieving were drawn to anyone who could offer any form of comfort. The most famous photograph taken by Mumler is a photograph of Mary Todd Lincoln posed with the purported spirit of her assassinated husband, though Mumler reportedly did not know that the woman he was taking a photograph of was the widowed Mrs. Lincoln. Supposedly, Mumler took these spirit photographs using double exposures of previous clients from photographic plates that had been improperly cleaned. In 1869, Mumler would be charged for fraud, but he was acquitted. But shortly after he was charged and acquitted, Mumler stopped taking ghost photographies and went back to more normal photography. The point here is that the history of photo manipulation is almost as long as the history of photography itself. So by the time the photograph known as the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall was taken, it was fairly common and even well known among the photographic community, which is why the first thing they did was check for double exposure. Today, the general consensus is that the photograph is fake, though how it was done seems to be up for debate, as many people offer various explanations. As for the people still living at Raynham Hall, the Townsend family, they do believe that Dorothy's restless spirit still walks the corridors of the estate, but they do not believe that the photograph is genuine. Lord Charles Raynham, the son of the present Marquis Townsend of Raynham, would tell the BBC that Dorothy isn't there simply to haunt the house, but she is really there, and he's glad that she's around. Which is an interesting take. I can certainly understand the comfort it might bring to have a family member or a loved one present in some way. But personally, I think I would rather the restless find peace in whatever way they can